Have you ever felt completely alone in the world, abandoned by everyone who should have cared about you? Imagine that loneliness amplified by hunger, cold, and the relentless fall of icy rain soaking through to your skin. Now imagine finding someone else in that same desperate situation, a kindred spirit whose suffering mirrors your own. Prepare yourself for a deeply moving story of two forgotten souls who found each other on the margins of society, proving that sometimes the greatest compassion comes from those who have the least to give. In the industrial outskirts of Detroit, where abandoned factories stand like monuments to better times, winter storms hit differently than they do in the manicured suburbs. There are fewer shelters from the biting wind, fewer warm places to escape the penetrating cold that seeps into bones and settles there like an unwelcome guest. It was in such a storm, with rain threatening to turn to sleet, that our story begins. At the rusted iron gates of Evergreen Cemetery, long neglected like much of the surrounding neighborhood, Marcus Johnson hadn't always been homeless. 3 years earlier, he had been a mechanic with a small apartment, a pickup truck, and even modest savings. But a workplace accident, inadequate insurance, and the opioid prescription that followed had sent him down a familiar spiral that eventually deposited him on the streets. Another statistic in America's housing crisis. At 52, his weathered face and graying beard made him look a decade older, though his eyes still held a quiet dignity that years of hardship hadn't managed to extinguish. On this particular evening, Marcus was making his way to the abandoned storage facility, where he had fashioned a relatively dry corner for himself, a space protected from the worst of the elements and hidden from the police who occasionally cleared out such makeshift shelters. His worldly possessions fit into the backpack he carried, a change of clothes, a tarp, a few toiletries, and the worn photograph of a woman and child he rarely showed to anyone. His pace was unhurried, despite the worsening weather. Experience had taught him that rushing only made the rain seem colder. As he approached the cemetery gates, something caught his attention, a movement that seemed out of place in the growing gloom. Squinting through the rain that streamed down his face, Marcus made out a shape tied to the gatepost, a form that trembled visibly, even from a distance. Drawing closer, his heart sank as the shape resolved into that of a dog, a medium-sized pit bull mix with patches of white and brown on its soaked coat, secured to the iron bars by a length of frayed rope that gave it barely enough room to lie down on the sodden ground. The dog's condition told Marcus everything he needed to know about how it had ended up in such a situation. Ribs protruded visibly from its sides, indicating long-term neglect rather than recent abandonment. One ear was partially missing, suggesting a history of dog fighting or abuse. Most telling was the way the animal cowered as Marcus approached, tucking its tail and lowering its head in the universal canine gesture of submission and fear, expecting a blow rather than kindness from human hands. For a moment, Marcus stood motionless in the rain, considering his options. He had barely enough food for himself, certainly not enough to share with a hungry dog. The place where he was staying strictly prohibited animals. Bringing one in would mean immediate eviction back into the elements. His lifestyle, constantly moving between shelters and makeshift camps, was hardly conducive to caring for a pet. Every practical consideration argued for walking past, for making this someone else's problem. Yet something kept Marcus rooted to the spot, unable to simply continue on his way. Perhaps it was the recognition of a fellow castaway, abandoned by the world that had once promised care. Perhaps it was the memory of his own daughter's dog, a gentle companion during the few years he had been granted as a father before tragedy, and his own demons took that role away from him. Or perhaps it was simply that, despite everything life had taken from him, Marcus still possessed the one thing that truly defined humanity, the capacity for compassion. "Hey there," he said softly, crouching down several feet from the trembling animal, his voice barely audible above the patter of rain. "Looks like we're both having a rough day, huh?" The dog's ears perked up slightly at the gentle tone, though its body remained tense, ready to cower or flee if the rope allowed. Marcus knew better than to approach too quickly. Fearful dogs were unpredictable, and the last thing he needed was a bite requiring medical attention he couldn't afford. Instead, he reached slowly into his backpack and unwrapped the half sandwich he had been saving for his dinner. Day-old bread, with a thin layer of peanut butter, obtained from the outreach van that visited the area once a week. His stomach protested as he tore off a piece and gently tossed it toward the dog, landing it just within reach of the tethered animal. "Go on," he encouraged as the dog sniffed tentatively at the offering. "It's not much, but it's something." The dog's hunger eventually overcame its fear, and it quickly devoured the morsel of food, its eyes darting between the remaining sandwich in Marcus's hand and his face, calculation and desperation evident in equal measure. With each piece Marcus tossed closer, the dog's posture softened slightly, fear gradually giving way to cautious hope, a transformation Marcus recognized from his own experiences with the rare acts of kindness he had encountered on the streets. By the time the sandwich was gone, the rain had intensified, cascading off the cemetery gates and forming rivulets that ran beneath the dog's matted fur. Marcus knew he couldn't leave the animal there. Hypothermia would claim it before morning if the coyotes that sometimes prowled the area didn't find it first. The rope securing the dog was tied in a complex knot, suggesting that whoever had left it there had wanted to ensure it couldn't escape, at least not quickly or easily. "Buddy," Marcus murmured, slowly extending his hand palm up toward the dog, allowing it to catch his scent. "I'm going to get you out of here, but you've got to trust me a little. Can you do that?" The dog's response was to stretch its neck forward cautiously, nostrils flaring as it assessed this strange human who offered food instead of threats. When it finally gave Marcus's fingers a tentative lick, he felt a surge of something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of being truly needed. Working carefully to avoid spooking the animal, Marcus examined the knot securing the rope to the gate. It was pulled tight, likely from the dog's attempts to free itself, and the rain had caused the rope fibers to swell and become even more difficult to manipulate. His fingers, stiff from the cold and years of hard labor, struggled with the wet cord. Finally, he reached into his pocket for his most valuable possession, a small pocket knife with a surprisingly sharp blade, useful for everything from opening cans to cutting cardboard for makeshift shelters. With a quick sawing motion, Marcus severed the rope about a foot from the dog's makeshift collar, leaving a length that could serve as a makeshift leash. "There we go," he said, standing slowly to avoid startling his new companion. "You're free from that gate, at least." But freedom from the gate still left the fundamental question unanswered. What would he do with this animal now? Where could they go together when he himself had nowhere truly safe to call home? The decision made, Marcus turned toward the storage facility, the newly freed dog following hesitantly at the end of its makeshift leash. "Come on," he urged gently when the animal paused, uncertain. "It's not much, but it's drier than here." The rain was coming down harder now, and both man and dog were thoroughly soaked, their movements slowed by the cold that had settled into their bodies. Marcus found himself talking continuously to the dog in a low, reassuring voice, something he rarely did anymore, having grown accustomed to the silence of his solitary existence. The abandoned storage facility loomed ahead, a sprawling single-story building with most of its windows boarded up, and no trespassing signs posted at regular intervals along the chain-link fence. Marcus had discovered a gap in the fence months earlier, carefully concealed behind overgrown bushes, and he now led the dog toward this secret entrance. "Gotta be quiet now," he whispered, ducking down to navigate the opening. The dog followed with surprising obedience, as if understanding the need for stealth. Inside the facility was a maze of corridors and empty storage units, most with their doors missing or hanging askew from broken hinges. Marcus had claimed a unit near the back of the building, far from the street and the occasional police patrols. It was dry, relatively clean, and most importantly, unknown to the other homeless individuals who sometimes sought shelter in the more accessible areas of the building. Leading the dog through the darkened hallways, Marcus felt an unfamiliar anxiety, not for himself but for the animal whose fate he had now entangled with his own. His living space was smaller than the average prison cell, just large enough for the foam pad that served as his bed, a milk crate containing a few books and personal items, and the corner where he kept his food safely elevated in a plastic bin to deter rats. Marcus had lined the walls with flattened cardboard boxes for insulation, creating a space that held warmth reasonably well, despite the drafts that whistled through the building on windy nights. It wasn't much, but after 2 years on the streets, it felt like a sanctuary. The dog stepped tentatively into the unit, sniffing the unfamiliar surroundings while keeping a watchful eye on Marcus. "Sweet home," Marcus said with a hint of irony, closing the makeshift door, a sheet of plywood that slid into place, concealing the unit from casual observation. He dug through his backpack for a plastic bowl he used for washing, filled it with water from one of his carefully rationed bottles, and set it down for the dog. "Drink up, buddy. We both need to get dry and warm." As the dog lapped thirstily at the water, Marcus used his only towel to dry its matted fur as best he could, speaking softly all the while. The animal tensed initially at his touch, but gradually relaxed, too exhausted and cold to maintain its wariness. Under the dirt and rain, Marcus could see that the dog's white and brown coat might actually be quite beautiful if properly cared for. "You need a name," he mused aloud, working gently to untangle a particularly bad mat near the dog's ear. "Can't just keep calling you dog or buddy." The name came to him as he examined the dog's face, now visible in the dim light of his battery-powered lantern. Despite the evidence of neglect and likely abuse, there was a quiet dignity in the animal's eyes, a resilience that resonated with Marcus's own hard-won survival. "Ghost," he decided, noting the predominant white of the dog's coat and the way it had appeared like an apparition at the cemetery gates. "You look like a ghost to me, what do you think?" The newly named Ghost responded with a slight wag of his tail, the first Marcus had seen. Food was the next immediate concern. Marcus's supplies were meager: half a pack of crackers, a can of beans, and an apple that was slightly past its prime. The sandwich he'd intended for his dinner was already in Ghost's stomach. Sighing, he opened the can of beans and divided its contents, giving the larger portion to the dog while saving a few spoonfuls for himself. "We'll figure something out tomorrow," he promised, watching Ghost devour the offering in seconds before looking up expectantly for more. Sleep proved elusive that night, despite Marcus's physical exhaustion. Ghost had settled on the floor beside his foam pad, initially maintaining a cautious distance, but gradually inching closer as the temperature in the storage unit dropped. By midnight, the dog was pressed against Marcus's side, both of them seeking warmth in the shared body heat. The unfamiliar presence was both comforting and unsettling. It had been years since Marcus had slept in proximity to another living being, and the responsibility weighed on him. "What am I going to do with you?" he whispered into the darkness. Morning brought with it a momentary disorientation as Marcus awoke to find Ghost's head resting on his chest, the dog's eyes watching him with quiet attentiveness. Outside, the rain had stopped, but Marcus could hear water dripping steadily through the facility's compromised roof, collecting in puddles that would make navigating the corridors treacherous. His stomach growled, a sharp reminder of the sacrifice he'd made the previous evening, and the challenges that lay ahead in feeding not just himself, but also his new companion. The first test of their new arrangement came almost immediately. Marcus's morning routine included visiting a public restroom in a nearby park to wash up and refill his water bottles, before the facility became busy with families and children who would look askance at a homeless man using the facilities. But bringing Ghost posed obvious problems. Animals weren't allowed in the public bathrooms, and leaving the dog tied outside would risk drawing attention, or worse, having him taken by animal control if someone reported an unattended pit bull. After careful consideration, Marcus decided to adapt rather than abandon his routine. He would find a different public bathroom, perhaps at the gas station several blocks away, where he could tie Ghost briefly in a less conspicuous location. "Ghost," he said, gathering his few toiletries and empty water bottles. "We've got to go out and face the world. You've got to be cool, understand? No barking, no drawing attention." The dog cocked his head as if considering these instructions. Their exit from the storage facility was uneventful, though Marcus took extra precautions, checking carefully for any signs of security or other homeless individuals who might notice Ghost and either report him or, worse, remember him as an identifying feature of Marcus's presence. The streets were relatively empty in the early morning hours, the industrial area slow to wake even on weekdays. Ghost stayed close to Marcus's side, seeming to understand instinctively the need to remain inconspicuous, his body language subdued but alert. The gas station proved to be a poor alternative. Its bathroom was visible from the checkout counter, making it impossible to sneak Ghost inside, and there was nowhere inconspicuous to tie him outside. Marcus moved on, growing increasingly aware of his own visibility with a dog in tow. Where he had once been largely invisible to the general public, just another homeless man easily overlooked, Ghost made them appear more noticeable, more memorable. It was a liability Marcus hadn't fully considered in his impulsive rescue. Their salvation came in the form of Riverside Park, a small neglected green space near the Detroit River, far enough from residential areas that it was usually deserted in the early morning. Here Marcus found a bathroom building with a blind spot behind it, where Ghost could wait out of sight while Marcus took care of his morning ablutions. "Stay," he commanded, securing the makeshift leash to a sturdy pipe. Ghost sat obediently, though his eyes followed Marcus with an intensity that spoke of fear of abandonment. Food remained the most pressing issue. Marcus had his regular spots for foraging. Dumpsters behind certain restaurants that discarded still edible food, a bakery that sometimes left day-old bread in boxes beside their delivery entrance, and the weekly outreach van that provided sandwiches and hygiene products. But none of these sources would easily accommodate a dog's needs, especially one as malnourished as Ghost, who required consistent, nutritious food to regain his health and strength. As Marcus contemplated their predicament, a memory surfaced from his early days on the street, a church on Jefferson Avenue that ran a small food pantry on Wednesday mornings. He had avoided the place for months, uncomfortable with the religious overtures that often accompanied charity, but necessity now overrode his reservations. "Come on, Ghost," he said, tugging gently on the leash. "I know somewhere we might get help, if we're lucky." He set off with renewed purpose, Ghost trotting obediently at his heels. St. Michael's Episcopal Church stood like an anomaly in the industrial landscape, its weathered stone facade and modest stained glass windows a remnant of more prosperous times when factory workers filled its pews each Sunday. Now it served a different purpose for the community, a haven for those the economic tides had left behind. Marcus approached cautiously, eyeing the small group already gathered near the side entrance marked "Food Pantry" in faded letters. Among those waiting was a wizened woman Marcus recognized from the streets, Eleanor, who pushed a shopping cart containing everything she owned and was known for feeding stray cats despite her own meager resources. She noticed Marcus and Ghost immediately, her face lighting with unexpected warmth. "Well, look who's got himself a friend," she called out, gesturing them over. "About time something good happened to you, Marcus Johnson." Eleanor's casual use of his name startled Marcus, who had worked hard to maintain anonymity in his homeless existence. "How do you?" he began, but Eleanor waved away his question with a knowing smile. "I know most everyone around here, been on these streets longer than you've been alive, seems like." She bent slowly to offer her gnarled hand to Ghost, who sniffed it cautiously, before allowing a brief pat on his head. "Found him tied up at Evergreen Cemetery last night in the rain," Marcus explained, surprised at how easily the words came after months of minimal human interaction. "Couldn't just leave him there." Eleanor nodded as if this were the most natural decision in the world, then reached into her cart and extracted a small bag of dog kibble, offering it to Marcus with a matter-of-fact gesture that brooked no refusal. "Take it," she insisted when he hesitated. "My cat friends don't eat as much as your big boy will. Sister Margaret always gives me extra anyway." The kindness from someone who had so little herself left Marcus momentarily speechless. He accepted the kibble with a gruff thanks, then poured a small handful into his palm for Ghost, who devoured it with obvious gratitude. The simple act of feeding the dog produced an unfamiliar warmth in Marcus's chest, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The church door opened and a middle-aged woman in simple clothing emerged, her grey hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her eyes swept over the small gathering, pausing momentarily on Marcus and Ghost before she spoke. "Good morning, friends. We'll start in just a few minutes. I see we have some new faces today." Her gaze returned to Marcus and his canine companion, a question in her expression. Eleanor took charge before Marcus could retreat into his habitual silence. "Sister Margaret, this here's Marcus, and he just rescued this poor dog from certain death at the cemetery. Dog was tied up in the rain, left to die." The directness of Eleanor's statement made Marcus uncomfortable, but Sister Margaret's expression softened immediately as she approached, keeping a respectful distance from Ghost, who was watching her with cautious attention. "You're both welcome here," she said simply, addressing Marcus directly. "We don't have proper dog food, but I can offer some meat and maybe a bone from the kitchen." The absence of judgment in her voice was startling. No questions about where Marcus lived or why he had taken in a dog when he could barely care for himself, just a straightforward offer of assistance that required no explanation or justification. Inside the church basement, the food pantry operated with quiet efficiency. Unlike some shelters Marcus had encountered, There was no required prayer service or religious lecture before assistance was provided. People lined up, requested what they needed from the available options, and volunteers filled bags accordingly. Ghost stayed pressed against Marcus's leg, visibly nervous in the enclosed space with unfamiliar people, but behaving with remarkable restraint. True to her word, Sister Margaret emerged from the kitchen with a small package wrapped in butcher paper. Some leftover roast beef and a soup bone, she explained, handing it to Marcus. And here's a bag for you. Extra protein since you're feeding two now. The paper bag she offered contained more substantial items than Marcus usually received from food pantries: canned tuna, peanut butter, a carton of eggs, bread, and even some fresh apples. It was enough to last them several days if carefully rationed. As they prepared to leave, Sister Margaret approached again, her manner casual, but her eyes assessing. "We could use some help around here, you know. The food deliveries come on Tuesday afternoons, and we need strong backs to unload the truck. It's just 2 hours a week, but we offer a hot meal afterward and extra supplies for volunteers." The offer hung in the air between them. Not charity, but an exchange, a chance for Marcus to earn what he received. For a moment, Marcus was transported back to his life before homelessness, the satisfaction of a job completed, the dignity of earning his way. Despite his circumstances, he had avoided begging, preferring to scavenge or do odd jobs when he could find them. "I could do that," he said finally, his voice rough with disuse. "We could do that," he amended, glancing down at Ghost, who looked up at him with what Marcus could have sworn was approval. "Excellent," Sister Margaret replied with a brisk nod, as if she'd expected no other answer. "We could also use help with general maintenance, minor repairs, some painting when the weather improves. My handyman retired last month and the building's showing its age." She paused, studying Marcus with shrewd eyes. "You mentioned you were a mechanic once? Those skills don't disappear." The casual reference to his past caught Marcus off guard. He hadn't mentioned his former occupation, which meant Eleanor had shared more than just his name. The realization that people had discussed him, remembered details about his life, was unsettling yet oddly warming. He had become so accustomed to invisibility that being seen, truly seen, as a person with a history and skills felt both invasive and affirming. Later, as Marcus and Ghost made their way back to the storage facility with their unexpected bounty, he found himself considering Sister Margaret's offer with growing interest. The prospect of regular meals and additional supplies was enticing, but it was the suggestion of meaningful work, of being useful again, that truly resonated. "What do you think, Ghost?" he asked, reaching down to ruffle the dog's ears. "Ready to become church volunteers?" Ghost's tail wagged in what Marcus chose to interpret as enthusiastic agreement. That night, Marcus shared the roast beef with Ghost, watching with satisfaction as the dog ate with slightly less desperate speed than the previous evening. Already he could swear the animal looked better, still painfully thin, still bearing the visible marks of neglect and possible abuse, but with a new alertness in his eyes and a tentative trust in his body language. "We got lucky today," Marcus told him, setting aside the soup bone for tomorrow. "Things might be looking up for both of us." The following Tuesday found Marcus standing nervously at the back entrance of St. Michael's, Ghost sitting patiently beside him. He had spent the morning at a public restroom, washing his clothes as best he could and trimming his beard with borrowed scissors from Eleanor, who had sought him out specifically to remind him of his commitment. First impressions matter, she had insisted with the authority of someone who had learned this lesson the hard way. Even for folks like us, Sister Margaret greeted them with the same matter-of-fact warmth she had shown at the food pantry, introducing Marcus to the small group of volunteers already gathered in the church's loading area. There was Tom, a retired postal worker who now lived in his car, Maria, a young woman who had escaped domestic violence and was staying at a nearby shelter, and Peter, a veteran whose mental health issues had cost him his job and eventually his home. Each nodded at Marcus with the quiet acknowledgement of shared experience, their eyes lingering curiously on Ghost. "He can stay in my office while we work," Sister Margaret offered, noting Marcus's hesitation to leave Ghost outside. "There's an old blanket he can use as a bed." The office turned out to be a cluttered but cozy room near the back of the church, with books stacked on every available surface and a desk buried under papers. Ghost circled the space cautiously before settling on the offered blanket. his eyes tracking Marcus until the door closed between them. The work was physically demanding but straightforward, unloading boxes of donated food from a delivery truck, sorting items by type, checking expiration dates and stocking shelves in the pantry's storage room. Marcus found his body remembering the rhythms of physical labor, muscles that had grown accustomed to the constant movement of survival, now channeled into purposeful activity. The familiar ache of exertion felt good, a reminder of capabilities that had lain dormant but not disappeared. When the truck was empty and the last box stored, Sister Margaret ushered them into the church kitchen, where a simple but hearty meal awaited: homemade soup, fresh bread, and a salad made from the garden behind the church. Marcus retrieved Ghost from the office, and to his surprise, no one objected when he brought the dog into the dining area. Sister Margaret simply set down a bowl of meat scraps and leftovers that she had evidently prepared in anticipation of Ghost's presence. Over the meal, conversation flowed more easily than Marcus had expected. No one asked prying questions about how he had ended up on the streets or why he had taken in a dog despite his circumstances. Instead, they discussed practical matters: which shelters had bed bugs, where to find public bathrooms that were reliably clean, which police officers were reasonable, and which were best avoided. It was the pragmatic exchange of survival information, but underlying it was a current of community that Marcus had been missing for longer than he cared to admit. As they were finishing their meal, Sister Margaret approached Marcus with a small first aid kit. "For your friend," she explained, nodding toward Ghost, who had settled contentedly at Marcus's feet after finishing his meal. Nothing fancy, just some antibiotic ointment for those cuts on his ears and neck. The rope left quite a mark. She demonstrated how to apply the ointment, her gentle handling earning a tentative lick from Ghost, a gesture of trust that seemed significant, coming from an animal with such obvious reasons to be wary of humans. The most unexpected moment came as Marcus was preparing to leave, his bag replenished with food for the coming days. Sister Margaret drew him aside, her expression thoughtful. "The church caretaker's apartment has been empty since Mr. Collins moved to assisted living," she said, watching his face carefully. "It's just a small efficiency in the basement. One room with a kitchenette and bathroom. Nothing fancy, but it's private and warm. The heating's included in the church utilities." Marcus stood frozen, unable to fully process what she seemed to be suggesting. "I can't afford," he began, but Sister Margaret interrupted with a raised hand. "I'm not offering charity, Marcus. I'm proposing an exchange. The apartment for 15 hours a week of maintenance work. The building needs consistent attention, and hiring outside help is beyond our budget. You'd be solving a problem for us." The careful way she framed the offer preserved his dignity while presenting a lifeline he hadn't dared hope for. 1,000 objections raced through Marcus's mind: his own unworthiness, the complications of his past, the risk the church would be taking on someone like him. But as Ghost leaned against his leg, grounding him in the present moment, Marcus found himself nodding slowly. "We could try it," he said cautiously. "A trial period, maybe, so you can see if it works out." His voice caught on the words, emotion threatening to overwhelm the careful control he had maintained through years of hardship. The apartment was indeed small, but to Marcus's eyes, it might as well have been a palace. Clean white walls, a narrow but comfortable-looking bed, a compact refrigerator and 2-burner stove, a bathroom with an actual door for privacy, luxuries he had almost forgotten existed. Ghost explored the space with growing excitement, his tail wagging as he discovered the simple braided rug that covered part of the linoleum floor, perfect for a dog to lie on. "It needs a good cleaning," Sister Margaret acknowledged, as Marcus stood speechless in the center of the room. "And some minor repairs. The kitchen faucet drips and one of the window screens is torn, but it's secure and the outside door locks properly." She handed him a key, a simple brass key that somehow weighed more in his palm than its physical mass could account for. "Take tonight to think about it. The offer stands if you want to start next week." But Marcus didn't need to think about it. The prospect of shelter, of safety, of a door that locked and a space that belonged, however temporarily, to him and Ghost, it was beyond anything he had allowed himself to hope for. "I'll take it," he said simply. "I'll start whenever you need me, and I'll fix the faucet and screen right away." The words came out in a rush, and he forced himself to stop, to breathe, to maintain some semblance of composure. Sister Margaret's smile held no pity, only satisfaction at a practical arrangement that benefited both parties. Good. We'll start Monday. 8 o'clock too early. When Marcus shook his head, she nodded briskly. I'll have a list of maintenance priorities ready by then. Nothing urgent. The building stood for 100 years, it'll last another weekend. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. Oh, and Marcus, dogs are allowed, obviously, but you'll need to keep him with you when you're working around the church. We have some parishioners who are nervous around larger breeds. That night, lying on a real bed for the first time in years, with Ghost curled contentedly at his feet, Marcus stared at the ceiling of his new home, his mind struggling to process the sudden reversal in his fortunes. All because he hadn't walked past a dog tied to a cemetery gate in the rain. All because he had acted on compassion when every practical consideration argued against it. The irony wasn't lost on him. In reaching out to save Ghost, he had inadvertently saved himself. Over the following weeks, a routine developed that gave structure to days that had previously been consumed by mere survival. Mornings began with maintenance work around the church, fixing leaky pipes, patching plaster, replacing light fixtures, clearing gutters, tasks that utilized the skills Marcus had feared were lost to him. Ghost accompanied him everywhere, quickly becoming a favorite with the church staff and regular volunteers, who snuck him treats and stopped to ruffle his ears. The transformation in Ghost was remarkable. Regular meals and medical attention had filled out his frame, revealing the handsome, muscular dog beneath the formerly skeletal exterior. His coat, now clean and brushed regularly thanks to supplies donated by a parishioner who worked at a pet store, gleamed with health. Most striking was the change in his demeanor. The fearful, cowering animal Marcus had found at the cemetery gate had been replaced by a confident, gentle companion who greeted familiar faces with a wagging tail and newcomers with cautious curiosity rather than terror. But the more profound transformation was in Marcus himself. Having a purpose beyond day-to-day survival renewed something essential that had been slowly dying within him. His sense of competence, of having value beyond the margins where society had placed him. The simple acts of fixing broken things, of being relied upon and meeting expectations, rebuilt his self-respect hour by hour, day by day. And the responsibility of caring for Ghost gave him a reason to care for himself as well, to maintain sobriety, to make choices that ensured stability for them both. 6 months after that rainy night at Evergreen Cemetery, Marcus stood in the church garden, watching Ghost chase butterflies through rows of tomato plants and herbs. The summer sun warmed his face, a pleasant contrast to the memory of cold rain that had once seemed like the defining condition of his existence. His hands, once chapped and raw from exposure, were calloused now from honest work, from building and repairing rather than merely enduring. The transformation of the small church garden had been his personal project, above and beyond his regular maintenance duties. What had once been an overgrown, neglected space was now a flourishing source of fresh produce for the food pantry. Marcus had discovered a forgotten talent for growing things, a knowledge absorbed from his grandmother decades earlier, but never utilized in his adult life. The physical act of nurturing life from soil connected him to a past he had thought lost, a time before pain and addiction, before homelessness and invisibility. Ghost had become an unofficial therapy dog for the church community, his gentle presence a particular comfort to elderly parishioners and children from the nearby family shelter. His tolerance for being petted seemed infinite, and he had an uncanny ability to sense when someone needed the silent companionship he offered. No one would have guessed this was the same terrified, abused animal that Marcus had cut from the cemetery gate half a year earlier. The investigation into Ghost's abandonment had yielded results that surprised everyone except perhaps Marcus, who had seen firsthand the cruelty humans could inflict on the vulnerable. The distinctive rope and the location had led animal control officers to a dogfighting ring operating in an abandoned warehouse just blocks from the cemetery. Ghost, it turned out, had been a bait dog, used to train fighting dogs, but deemed too gentle-natured to fight himself, then discarded when he was too injured to be useful. When the case went to court, Marcus had testified about finding Ghost, his voice steady as he described the dog's condition and the deliberate cruelty of leaving him exposed to the elements without food or water. It was the first time in years that Marcus had entered a courthouse voluntarily. The first time his word had been valued in an official proceeding, rather than dismissed because of his appearance or circumstances. The conviction of the ringleaders had brought a sense of justice not just for Ghost but for Marcus himself, an acknowledgement that compassion had power beyond the immediate act of mercy. Sister Margaret had been right about Marcus's mechanical skills not disappearing. In fact, they had expanded during his time at St. Michael's. What began as basic maintenance had evolved into more skilled renovations as he gained confidence and access to proper tools. The church basement, once damp and unwelcoming, had been transformed under his hands into a warm community space with improved lighting, repaired flooring, and walls brightened by a fresh coat of paint donated by a local hardware store. The most unexpected development had come 3 months into his residency at St. Michael's, when a parishioner who owned an auto repair shop mentioned needing part-time help. The offer of 2 days a week at fair wages had seemed almost too good to be true, but Sister Margaret had vouched for Marcus without hesitation. "He's the most reliable handyman this church has ever had," she had declared, the matter-of-fact praise more meaningful than any effusive compliment could have been. Now with stable housing and part-time employment that utilized his professional skills, Marcus had begun the slow process of rebuilding his legal identity, replacing his lost social security card, obtaining a state ID, opening a basic bank account where his modest earnings could accumulate rather than being at risk in his pocket. Each step was a reclamation of citizenship in a society that had once seemed determined to erase him, a society to which he was now cautiously revealing himself again. Ghost had been central to this reintegration, serving as both catalyst and anchor. The dog's needs had pushed Marcus to interact more regularly with others, to establish routines, to make connections he might otherwise have avoided. And Ghost's unwavering loyalty provided emotional security during moments when the weight of the past threatened to overwhelm the progress of the present. On the darkest nights, when old traumas surfaced in dreams, Ghost's solid warmth beside him was a tangible reminder that neither of them was alone anymore. Among the church community, the story of Marcus and Ghost had taken on an almost mythic quality. The homeless man and the abandoned dog, each saving the other through an act of compassion that defied practical sense. Marcus sometimes overheard parishioners retelling it to newcomers, often with embellishments that made him uncomfortable in their heroism. The reality had been simpler and more complicated, a moment of connection between two discarded beings, a recognition that sparked action when inaction would have been easier. What the storytellers couldn't understand unless they had experienced it themselves, was how thin the line between connection and isolation could be, how easily a human could slip from the center of community to its outermost margins. Marcus had crossed that border in both directions now, carried first by a spiral of loss and addiction, then back again by the simple decision to stop for a dog in distress. The journey had taught him that worthiness wasn't something you earned or lost based on circumstances. It was inherent, a birthright that society might ignore but could never truly revoke. As summer faded into fall, Marcus received an unexpected letter forwarded through the church, the first communication from his estranged daughter in over 5 years. The carefully neutral tone couldn't disguise her cautious hope, sparked by news of his stability that had reached her through mutual acquaintances. The final lines had brought him to his knees. "Dad, I heard about the dog you rescued. Mom always said you had the biggest heart of anyone she knew. Maybe she was right after all." Ghost had sat beside him as he read and reread the letter, the dog's head resting on his lap in silent support. The reply had taken days to compose, each word weighed for its honesty and impact. Marcus had no illusions about instantly reconstructing a relationship fractured by years of hurt and absence. But the letter represented possibility, a door not fully closed, a future that might include reconnection. In his response, he had included a photo of himself and Ghost taken by Sister Margaret in the church garden, visual evidence of the new life he was building, the stability he had found through an unexpected act of rescue. Looking back now on that rainy night at the cemetery gates, Marcus could trace how a single moment of compassion had altered the trajectory of his life. He had stopped for Ghost when it made no logical sense to do so, when he had nothing to offer but shared misery and the slimmest protection from the elements. The decision had seemed insignificant at the time, just another human being unable to walk past suffering when they recognized its reflection in themselves. Yet that small choice had created ripples that continued to expand outward, touching lives beyond his own in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. In the end, perhaps that was the most powerful lesson Ghost had taught him. That even those who appear to have nothing still possess the capacity to give, that compassion itself is a resource that multiplies rather than diminishes when shared. The world might measure worth in possessions and achievements, in status and influence, but there existed another economy altogether, one in which a homeless man and an abandoned dog could be each other's salvation, creating from their broken pieces a wholeness neither could have achieved alone.